So let's reorient ourselves to the book of Amos. Remember, at this time, what we would call the Promised Land, where the Jewish people is in the land that is right there off the Mediterranean coast, has been split into two kingdoms. It's not the way God intended. God wanted all 12 tribes to be in unity, to bless the land that they were living in, and from there be a blessing to the whole world. But as so often happened with the Israelites, they rebelled against God, they warred against each other. 10 of the kingdoms said, we're going to be the northern kingdom. 2 of the tribes in the south, including Judah and Benjamin, said, okay, well, we have Jerusalem. We're the true Israel in a sense. And there was this separation, distinction, sometimes civil war between these two kingdoms almost since the inception of the kingdom, only really surviving through David and Solomon. Now, we are here in the days of Amos, 100 years plus after the time of David and Solomon, and we are actually entering into a time of relative peace for both Israel and Judah. Northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. Look on the map and you can see it printed in color and everything for you, so you can see how that roughly maps out geographically. Now remember, the northern kingdom, with its 10 tribes, had been in constant rebellion and disobedience for its entire existence. They never had a good king. They just had string after string of bad kings. Bad not only meaning, let's say, politically or legislatively bad, but morally wicked and evil as well. And they don't realize it, but they, as a nation, are a dead man walking. That the prophets are coming to tell them, you need to shape up, and you won't. And so judgment is coming for you. The southern kingdom, for its part, it had a mix of good and bad kings throughout its history, but eventually judgment was going to come for them as well. So you kind of get in deep into the history of these kingdoms, and there's a time frame where God was calling out to them, like a friend who is trying to reach out to an addict and saying, look, we haven't seen you in a while, and I think you're getting into some trouble here. Please stop. If you need help, I'm right here. I can help walk you through this. And God did that. God did that through what are called the writing prophets. I kind of like the way the Expositor's Bible Commentary phrases it, so I'm just going to quote them. But the 8th century witnessed the rise of one of the most potent moral forces the world has ever known, the writing prophets. These men from widely separated backgrounds shared an overwhelming conviction that God had called them. They had various styles of writing, but all wrote with the authority of the Almighty. They denounced the sins of their contemporaries and also looked far into the future as they spoke of deliverance for both Jew and Gentile. I just like that idea. One of the most potent moral forces the world has ever known. And the commentator there is talking about like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, all these prophets. I just like the phrasing of that. The world has never known such men who just came onto the scene to speak with such authority directly from God to a people. And what is the sad truth of it? Did they listen? No. They rejected it, just as people still do now. Now, Amos is one of these writing prophets. If you remember, he was plucked from obscurity. What was he? He was a cattle herder. He was a tree tender, and Yahweh called on him. I've got something else for you to do. It's a little bit outside of your wheelhouse. I need you to pronounce judgment on all the surrounding nations of Israel and tell them that God's wrath is going to be upon them. So have fun with that, right? I mean, this is not his job, but it is now. It wasn't something perhaps even thought much about, but now it was going to be his burden. And such it is sometimes the call of Christ. Maybe he came to you all of a sudden, and you got saved, and there was joy in it, but then you suddenly also simultaneously realized the burden. I am now called to walk as Christ walked. I am now called to preach the good news, which means telling people the bad news, that they are sinners. And so Amos, a lot like us, I'm sure, feeling very blessed and also burdened, we'll say that, to be called by God to be a prophet. Now, the opening chapters of Amos are almost exclusively judgments upon nations. If you look at your handout, there are several there, and there's like A, B, C, D, E, F with the scripture. It's really small. It's hard to see, I know, but if you squint, you can make out the different places. And there's an important thread that this reminds us of, though, is that throughout the Old Testament, God has said over and over again, he does not overlook sins, that no one gets away with what they're doing. And that's true of the most powerful governors and kings to the lowliest shepherd. That as even the nations of the world commit sin and do wicked and evil to other nations and to their own people, God has said over and over again, I will not hold them guiltless or without punishment. This is true for the nations that existed at the time of Amos. It's also true for every nation that has risen and fallen ever on this planet. Of course, it's true for every person that's ever lived. That there must be an accounting. If there is such a thing as good and evil, there must be a reckoning of the good and evil. And for those who have done evil, mustn't there be judgment? There's another thread that runs through that, of course, is the theme of salvation, and it's woven into every proclamation of judgment. That's somewhat implicit. It's almost a paradox, because God is saying this is surely going to happen, and at the same time, woven in is, so repent. What are you doing? Stop it. Knock it off. And there have been precious few times where someone did, and God forestalled judgment. You think of Nineveh. But God is consistent. He is consistent in his application of this judgment. He even weaves this in to his own people, that he will call not just the nations around Israel and around Judah to judgment, but he will hold the same standard to Israel and Judah. And if they lack, if they fall short, judgment also coming for them. There's an ominous comment in 2 Kings 21 that I came across recently. You don't necessarily have to turn there. You can if you want to. But in 2 Kings 21, we're coming to the end of Judah. So northern kingdom of Israel, they're going to be judged. 100 years later, 150 years later or so, judgment's going to come upon Judah as well. And these are those days leading up to it. There's a lot of wickedness that's happening. In 2 Kings 21:9, but they did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than the nations had done, whom Yahweh destroyed before the people of Israel. You can read on. And he goes on to describe the kinds of things that they did that provoked him to anger, shedding innocent blood and worshiping other gods. So, Judah, Israel, you did the same things as the pagan nations around you. In fact, you did worse than them. So should not there be a judgment? And so even as we go through these judgments over the next few weeks, we should understand that God is vindicated in these judgments, and he's consistent in these judgments. And we must believe that there is going to be an account for wrongdoing. Otherwise, keep doing wrong. What's the consequence? If you can get away with it, keep doing it. But if there is a moral universe that we live in, and there must be a reckoning, an accounting, a judge of it, and there is the same God who made it. And he's going to be consistent. He must be, not applying one standard to one person, another standard to another person. He must be consistent in his judgment, which we see, which he is. And so we should understand that God is going to judge me also, and you. And if that's the case, how do we avoid a just punishment, being guilty? Of course, that's what the gospel is about, and that's interwoven here as well. Okay, well, let's start here. We're going to just cover like one verse. Oh, no, 3 verses. Amos 1:2. And he said, Yahweh. And I say that because when you see the capital Lord, that's not the Hebrew word Adonai, which means Lord, as in a person that is over you. When it's capitalized like that, it's referring to God's actually covenant special name, Yahweh, which was revealed to Moses. Moses said, who is sending? Who shall I say is sending me? You see, God says, tell him Yahweh is sending you. I am that I am. So that's his name. It's not a title, it's a name. Yahweh roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. Amos receives a vision of judgment, and it begins in Zion. What is Zion? What is that referring to? Well, originally, Jerusalem was occupied by these people called the Jebusites, and they had a stronghold on Jerusalem, a fortress, and that was originally called Zion. Now, as the Old Testament progressed, David conquered Jerusalem, the idea of Zion expanded to include the whole city, but with the kind of extra connotation of a stronghold or a safe place, a fortified place. But generally speaking, the Old Testament Zion is used as a name for the city of Jerusalem, the land of Judah, or even the nation of Israel as a whole. So it's like we can use Washington, D.C. to speak of America as a whole. So if we said, and Washington, D.C. decided that we're going to enter into negotiations with blah, 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 well, that's kind of a way of saying the whole country is, right? It's not just one city, the capital, but the whole nation is. And Zion can be used in that sense to cover that whole range of meaning. Well, Yahweh is there, and it says here that he's roaring from Zion. What does that mean? Well, roaring in the Old Testament almost always means like a lion. This is that auditory projection of power. I went to the zoo not too long ago, and we're watching some lionesses like roaming around, and then all of a sudden, just this deep bellowing sound came from the side, and it almost sounded fake, but it was so like kind of deep and resonating. You know what it was? A lion was over there roaring, and it was intimidating. Like it almost felt surreal. Lions roar to project their power, their ferocity. It is intended to make you sit up and pay attention, to have a little shaking in your boots. In other words, the authoritative voice of God is coming from Jerusalem. The lion is also not just, this king of the jungle. It is oftentimes also indicative of a king. So this is the king sitting in Zion, and he is roaring authoritatively into the nations of the world. And this is pointing to Christ, who is the descendant of King David, who will rule in Jerusalem as the Lion of Judah. So we're talking about a king ruling, speaking authoritatively to the nations. It's a little picture of Christ. What is that voice saying? It's not just a roar. It is saying something, and it's shown verbally in the text. Thus says Yahweh, thus says Yahweh, thus says Yahweh. You're going to see it numerous times all through chapters 1 and 2. So that's the content of it. But what's the effect of it? This is actually what's significant. This is how it's starting. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. And you read that, it's like, what does that mean? I don't get that. This is like really poetic language, and I haven't studied poetry since 8th grade. So break this down for me. That's how I felt. Break this down for me, because I didn't really get it at first either. No, it's the pastures that are mourning and wailing, not the shepherds. It's not the shepherds out in the fields, like saying, "Oh, this is so terrible." It's the fields themselves. The fields themselves are in mourning, are in loss. This is poetic language for the grass and the fields where all the livestock graze, that it's barren and cursed. It cannot sustain life. It is crying because it is bereft of any ability to sustain the life of the livestock. The pastures are the place where the animals feed and graze and live. And the fields are mourning because they cannot offer that. Similarly, Carmel, which was actually a mountain range, was known for being a rich land. Carmel means a vineyard or orchard or garden. It's famously where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal, but that's not what's in mind here. Carmel withering is the same kind of picture as the pastures mourning, that this fertile land, which is usually rich with vegetation, is now dry and withered, empty of anything to harvest. In other words, a land is cursed. The land is deserted. The land has been judged by God. It's a poetic way of saying God is uttering judgment as the king to pronounce judgment on the physical land, and that is being used as a picture of a judgment on the peoples of the land as well. Now, the first nation to be discussed in this list of nations that are being judged is Damascus, or Aram. If you hear Aram or Arameans, it's also the same people as the people of Damascus. Damascus is a city. The people around it now we call Syrians, and back then were called Syrians as well. So there's a connection. Imagine, this was written 3,000 years ago, about give or take a few hundred years, and we're still talking about Syria and Damascus. As we mentioned actually in the morning service a couple weeks ago, I think, when we're studying Paul's conversion. Remember, where was he going? He's on the road to Damascus. And Damascus, as we said, is the oldest continually occupied city in human history. It's very ancient roots, still occupied now, still in the news now, right? Damascus is the capital of Syria, and so we have the whole nation in mind, not just the city. Thus says Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. Because they have threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron, so I will send a fire upon the house of Hazael, and it shall devour the strongholds of Ben-Hadad. I will break the gate bar of Damascus and cut off the inhabitants from the valley of Aven, and him who holds the scepter from Beit Eden, and the people of Syria shall go into exile to Kir, says Yahweh. You read that, like, what is happening here? Where are these places? Why do I care? Well, that's what we're here for, all right? So what we're going to do, I'm going to give a little bit of background to what's happening in verse 3 there, and then we're going to just kind of understand Syria biblically. And we're going to see the history and learn the lessons of Syria that's leading up to this point, okay? So you will, by the end of it, you'll be a biblical Syrian expert. Because that's what you wanted when you woke up this morning. I really, really wish I knew a lot more about Syria in the Bible. Well, wish granted. Okay, so first off, this expression for 3 and for 4, for 3 transgressions and for 4, it's. I think the way we can understand it, it's like, 3 strikes and you're out, right, in baseball. And this would be like a batter gets the 3rd strike, but just for good measure, they swing again on the 3rd strike just to get a 4th strike. It's like over and above. It's like extra. You're already out, but they're like, but I'm going to add 1 more strike. It's so Syria already had done enough to warrant the pouring out of God's wrath. 3. But they're so bad, so wicked, they're like, but wait, there's more. And they threw in another sin. So it's just an expression of they over abundantly, emphatically, just to make sure that you knew they were wicked. They said, 3 is good, 4 is better. And I'm going to sin a little extra hard. So sprinkle some more sin on their sin. What had they done? It says they threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. So this is an agricultural picture. We're not accustomed to this, but back then you would harvest your grain. You'd put them on a threshing floor. Now you're trying to separate the grain part from the stalks, right? So they would have these threshing sleds, which were these parallel boards, and on the bottom you had metal or stone spikes, and you would just drag it over, and it would just kind of grind and separate the grain out. And then what you'd have to do is you would, what's the word I'm looking for? When you winnow, thank you. You'd winnow that grain. So you'd separate out all of the chaff, which is all the husks, from the grain. So that's what you'd take, maybe like a rake or something, and you'd lift it up in the air after you've threshed it, and when there's a good breeze, you do this on a hilltop, it would blow away the husks, and the grains being heavier would fall, and you gather the grains. That's a process here. Well, Obviously, this is not something you'd want to subject a person to in any of that. Now, it's probably not the case that the Syrians literally went across the Jordan River. If you look on your map there, you see the Jordan River between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, and that region to the east of the Jordan River, that land is called Gilead, and some of the Israelites had settled there. It's not that they went over there and then they just dragged people literally with a sledge. This is just talking about their oppression of them. They were brutal and violent, but they had gone over and pillaged and tried to generally conquer and or disturb the life of the people in Gilead in violent and brutal ways. So, because they did that, though, and we'll see that fleshed out a little bit about what kind of people they were. God says, I will send a fire upon the house of Hazael, and it shall devour the strongholds of Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad is like a dynastic name. It means literally son of Hadad. Hadad is the Syrian god of storm and thunder. It's kind of like Thor. And there's multiple Ben-Hadads, or as we say in my house, Ben-Hadad, mentioned in Scripture. And they're all kings of Syria. It's kind of like a title, like president. So we have a lot of presidents. They had a lot of Ben-Hadads. Hazael is the name of one particular gentleman who's mentioned in 2 Kings 8. We'll get to that. But the point is, God is going to judge Syria by judging the leadership. In particular, the house of Hazael, and then the strongholds of Ben-Hadad break the gate bar of Damascus. In those days, you protected your city with gigantic walls. You didn't have ring doorbells. You didn't, anything like that. If you wanted to protect your city, you had a wall around it. But of course, you want people to come in and out, so you had a gate. And at night, you'd close those gates, and you put a big bar to keep people from going in and out, especially pesky invaders. And so to break that bar is to say you will be open to invasion. You'll be open to attack. And that's what ended up happening is they get conquered. And not quite sure what Aven and Beit Eden, where they are. We'll get to that at the end. So now here's the part where we become a little bit of a Syrian history expert. In Judges 10:6, Syria is listed amongst the neighbors of the Israelites that was full on into pagan idolatry. So it's an inauspicious list. It's not a list you want to be on of wicked nations that the Israelites were going to come into and have to deal with, and that they were tempted by the Baals and the Ashtaroth, the gods of Assyria. So right off the bat, Syria is listed as an enemy of the Israelites and a temptation to the Israelites. Isn't that funny? Actually, this is a huge theme of the Old Testament, is their enemies were oftentimes also their temptation. Right? People that are hostile to them, rather than being hostile in return, so often they would be buddy-buddy and friends with them. It's like, you should stay away from drug dealers, right? They're your enemy, but then you get buddy-buddy, you know someone, and then they become a source of temptation because you got to know the guy, and he's kind of an okay guy, just happens to be a drug dealer, and then he starts offering you drugs, and then all of a sudden this someone who should be your enemy is now tempting you. It's kind of like that. So Syria is one such neighbor. 1 Kings 15. We are into the area now outside of Judges, where there's judges ruling the land, and we're into the era of kings ruling and reigning over both Israel and Judah. And you have a good king, Asa of Judah, who's warring with the northern kingdom. So there's a civil war, right? Israel and Judah, they become two distinct nations. They're brothers. There should be in the land united, but instead they're conflicting. We don't like your leadership. We don't like your worship. And so King Asa, who's a good king of Judah, he starts fighting with King Baasha of the northern kingdom, who's a wicked king. And in a very baffling decision, because King Asa, he's a good king, he asks for the help of Ben-Hadad of Assyria. Because if you look on your map, it's a pincher move. You get Syria on your side as Judah, and you can pincher Israel. Now, this is bizarre because Asa, you're a good king. Why are you doing this? And Ben-Hadad, for his part, he agrees, even though he's kind of friendly with the kingdom of Israel. So Asa gets rebuked by a prophet, Hanani, in 2 Chronicles 16, 7 through 10. And the prophet Hanani says to Asa, why did you pursue the help of man rather than pursue God and help from him? And so he's rebuked for it in 2 Chronicles 16, 7 through 10. And Asa, not repentant. I don't know why. He's considered a good king, and the text actually says he's a good king. But he gets so angry, he throws this prophet in stocks. And then the text says he began to commit cruelties against the people. I mean, he was so upset to be called out by his sin, he doubled down on sinning some more. He gets a disease. It's so fun. He gets a disease in his foot and becomes very severe. But instead of seeking Yahweh again, he goes and seeks out physicians. So Asa has this pattern of seeking help from men and not from God. And Syria, Ben-Hadad represents that. Very early on, Syria represents man's attempt, the good people of Israel, or the Israelites, to trust in people rather than God. That's one of the lessons to learn from Syria, is that does not ever work out well in the Bible. To trust people rather than God in those scenarios where it matters the most. And Asa, to double down on it and then die. It doesn't say he necessarily died of the foot disease, but you get that implication. And you also get the implication that if he had sought Yahweh, he would have been healed. But instead he sought these physicians. That's not to say that anytime anything ails you, don't go to a doctor. That's not the point of that. In this case, it's kind of clear that the disease in his foot was intended by God to bring him, come back to me. Come to me first. And maybe I'll tell you go see a doctor, but come to me first. And he refuses. The next mention of Syria comes from 1 Kings 19. Now, we actually talked about this not too long ago, because this is the same passage where Elijah, one of the most prominent prophets of the Old Testament, is fleeing Jezebel. I mean, he's one of the most significant prophets of the Old Testament, second maybe only to Moses. He's defeated the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, as we mentioned earlier. And then Jezebel starts hunting him down, and he runs. He runs for the hills. And God meets him in those hills. We talked about this already. Part of God's gentle confrontation of Elijah's fearful heart is to tell him, you're still significant in my plan. You're going to be an anointer. You're going to anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. You're going to anoint the new king over Israel, and you're going to anoint your protege, Elisha. So you're going to anoint these three people. Anoint a foreign king, anoint a king of Israel, and anoint your own replacement. And this was to encourage him that that God's sovereign and in control. That God is affirming Elijah's prophetic ministry. So there's kind of a personal encouragement that God's giving Elijah. But he's also saying, Elijah, I'm in the one that's in sovereign control of the nations rising and falling. What you are doing here is not without point. You just have to trust that I'm in control. So I'm going to have you anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Now at this point, Syria has been this like a perennial enemy of Israel over and over again. And yet God is showing his sovereign power over and his purpose for even the enemy, the hostile nations. God is the one who establishes rulers and thrones and kingdoms, even the evil ones, even now. In 1 Kings 20, the next chapter, Hazael's not in power yet. The king of Syria, again, it's another Ben-Hadad, he fights against Israel. But this evil king Ahab defeats him. Ben-Hadad had even enlisted 32 other kings to fight against Israel, but God was gracious. Now, Ahab was a very wicked king. He's a especially wicked king. His wife, Jezebel, especially wicked queen. And they collaborated often. They killed the prophets of God. They worshipped Baal. Later on, you're going to see they murdered a man just for his vineyard. So they're particularly wicked people. They're particularly hostile to God. They're even particularly hostile to Elijah because Ahab's wife, Jezebel, was trying to hunt him. And yet God showed this tremendous mercy by delivering Ben-Hadad into Ahab's hands. What does that show us? Well, here Syria is reminding us of God's mercy, even to an unjust and unworthy Israel. God was using Syria to demonstrate, don't trust Syria, trust me. But then now he's using Syria. You see what happens? I'm even showing you mercy through Syria. You don't deserve the victory here. You're not bigger or greater than Syria and these 32 kings. The only reason you won is because my hand was upon you. But, 1 Kings 20, Ahab screws this up. He has Ben-Hadad in his hand, and he lets Ben-Hadad go instead of either, killing him or doing anything more. Basically just says, let bygones be bygones. You go ahead. like, what? What are you doing? And so he lets Ben-Hadad go, and then 3 years later, 2 Kings 21, they're fighting again. You let him go. It's because you let him go. So now they're fighting again. 2 Kings 21 is that famous or infamous story of Ahab and Jezebel murdering Naboth for his vineyard. And God condemns him for this. He says, you've gone too far. I've been showing you mercy. And now you've murdered an innocent man just for what? His land. So you and Jezebel, a judgment is coming. And who's going to be the instrument of that judgment against Ahab, do you think? Well, it's Syria. 1 Kings 22, Ahab enters into a foolish war against Syria while allying himself with Jehoshaphat. And I'm just bringing it up because it's a fun name to say. Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, Ahab says, hey, let's go fight those Syrians, all right? And Jehoshaphat, all right, we're family. We go into wars together, right? And so what they don't realize, or they should have realized, is this is a setup by God. That God is going to use this battle to judge Ahab, and Ahab ends up dying in this battle at the hand of the Syrians. And so Syria now, in this case, is an instrument of God's judgment against Ahab. So notice how Syria has been used to demonstrate both God's mercy and God's judgment. So we are getting lessons through Damascus, so to speak, of how God operates, that he can use this evil nation as his instrument and tool of discipline, of punishment. He will do it with the Babylonians against Judah, as Habakkuk will discover. Now, Elijah dies, and Elisha, his protege, takes up the mantle of his ministry, and the next mention of Syria is in 2 Kings. So 1 Kings is 22 chapters, so we just talked about chapter 22. 2 Kings, it just continues on the story. I don't know necessarily why they broke it up, except that it's long otherwise. But really, they're just one in the same one book. In 2 Kings 5, Syria is mentioned again. Now it's a totally different context. You're introduced to a man named Naaman. And he's a commander of the army of the king of Syria. So he has fought against Israel before at the behest of Ben-Hadad, his king. But he comes down with leprosy. Leprosy is this wasting disease. There's no cure for it at this time. And he has heard from a servant girl that they'd captured from Israel that, there's a prophet in Israel who could totally heal this. Too bad. Too bad you're not in Israel. Too bad you're on the outs with Israel. Well, Naaman is desperate enough that he goes to the king and he asks a favor. Do something to help me. And so the king of Syria sends a letter down to Israel and asks, so I have a general here, my servant. I'm sending him with this letter. Can you cure him of leprosy? Now, you might think that your enemy asking you for a favor, no way. Of course not. And that's exactly what the king of Israel says. Like, this is a trick. Man, there's no way. He's seeking to quarrel with me. He says, am I God to kill and to make alive? And this man sends word to me, cure a man of his leprosy? He's just trying to pick a fight. This is somehow a trick. But you know who happened to hear that the king had gotten a note? Is Elisha. And so Elisha sends a message to the king of Israel and says, no, have him come. Okay. So I won't get into the details of the story, but Naaman meets Elisha, and he, this proud general and this enemy of Israel, he becomes the only person in the Old Testament healed of a naturally occurring leprosy. I say that because technically Moses' sister Miriam was afflicted with leprosy because she was being snarky as a judgment. Moses prayed for her, and it healed after 7 days. But that was like a judgment leprosy. And then King Uzziah, later on, he gets afflicted with leprosy because he offered incense in the temple when that's only for Levites. And it doesn't say he was healed. So most would consider that Naaman is the only person in the Old Testament that is like healed of leprosy, where the leprosy wasn't necessarily like a judgment. But he is a Gentile, non-Jew. He's not just a Gentile, he's an enemy. He's not just an enemy, he leads the armies of the enemy nation against and to kill the Israelites. And that is who God chooses to heal and save. Even Jesus mentions this in Luke 4:27. He says, and there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. And he said this in a context where he's rebuking the synagogues. And when they heard these things, all in the synagogue were filled with wrath. He's basically saying, you don't get it. You don't get God's mercy. You don't get God's character and nature. You think he owes you something because you have the blood of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in your veins. But look at Naaman. He saved him. He had not an ounce. He had not a drop of Jewish blood in him. So here, Syria is a picture, again, not only of God's mercy towards Syria, but it even looks ahead to God's salvation of the Gentiles in general. God's eye and his heart, even in the very Jewish-centric Old Testament, showing and highlighting God's kindness and saving power towards non-Jews. And hey, I'm not a Jewish person, so I mean, this preaches to me. This preaches to my heart. Now, next chapter, they're still fighting. Verse 2 Kings 6:8. Once again, the king of Syria was warring against Israel. Now, I wonder how involved Naaman would have been at this point. Maybe he had retired. It doesn't say much about him. I have a hard time thinking that he would have picked up arms against Israel again, but the text doesn't say. In any case, there's again continuing war, surprise, surprise, between Israel and Syria. And they lay a siege in chapter 6 and 7 against Samaria. Samaria is the capital of Israel, the northern kingdom. And God is once again merciful to Israel. Even though, again, Israel, evil kings only, always wicked, always rebellious, once again, God shows mercy towards Israel, and he causes the Syrians to just take flight. And actually, lepers, so those afflicted with leprosy, figures into that story as well. I don't necessarily want to do all the tie-ins, but God mercifully, graciously causes the Syrians to take flight. In 2 Kings 8 is when you finally have that Hazael. Remember, Elijah anointed Hazael to be king of Syria and Jehu to be king of Israel and Elisha to be his replacement. Finally, in Elisha's time, Hazael becomes king. It's kind of, I won't get into the details. It's sort of interesting because King Ben-Hadad gets sick, and he sends Hazael to Israel. Ask the prophet, am I going to die from this sickness? And Hazael, Elisha says, he will heal from this. He will recover from it, but he will certainly die. Like, what? Like, say to him, you shall certainly recover, but Yahweh showed me that he will certainly die. Is that a contradiction? Is Elisha telling Hazael to die, to lie? No. It's Hazael has the burden to tell the king. Elisha said, you're going to recover from this. But what does Hazael choose to do is kill him. He murders Ben-Hadad. Does he have to? No, he doesn't have to. So it's just true. I mean, you can read it for yourself, but Elisha's not lying or telling him to lie. Hazael very well could have just said, you're going to recover from this. And if he had done nothing, he would have lived. But Hazael chooses, with the knowledge that Elisha's also saying he's going to die. Well, yeah, actually, that does sound pretty good. I mean, if Ben-Hadad dies, I'll be king. And so it becomes the case where you have kind of God's sovereignty and human will just, intersecting and meshing that way. That's exactly what he does. And here's the hard part about this. Elijah anointed him years prior. Elisha is telling him, go to Ben-Hadad and say these things. And as he's doing this, Elisha starts to weep. And Hazael in 2 Kings 8:12 says, why does my Lord weep? He answered, because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. You will set on fire their fortresses, and you will kill their young men with the sword, and dash in pieces their little ones, and rip open their pregnant women. I remember reading this to my kids, and they're like, what? That's wicked. That's awful. Who would tear open, dash in pieces little ones and rip open pregnant women? Like, have you heard of abortion? I mean, it's kind of what that is. They couldn't even, it didn't even enter their mind. That's a phrase that's used sometimes where God is talking about the sins of the nations, and God will say, this didn't even enter my mind to do this wickedness. Now, that's an expression. God knows everything. But it's to induce a shock value, like you've created an evil that God himself cannot even comprehend. Oh, he can, but it's intended to give you a sense of how outside of any kind of morality you've gone. And it's like, I can kind of remind my kids, like, they couldn't even conceive of anyone doing this or how this could happen. It's how evil and wicked this is. And here Elisha is, knowing that Elijah has anointed him to be king, knowing that he is going to be king. Elisha, he could, take a knife and stab the guy. Stop him from doing this, right? And yet he knows that God is intending for this evil man to be an instrument of divine judgment and justice against Israel. And yet, knowing that he still has the response of pity, sorrow, compassion, he knows that Israel, in a sense, is going to deserve this kind of treatment. Because remember, Israel and Judah both have done more evil than the nations around them. They deserve it. They deserve worse. But he still has pity and compassion in his heart. That's sort of the calling of every prophet, every Christian, every pastor, is you hold those both in tension. You need to proclaim the exceeding sinfulness of sin and how wicked and awful and offensive it is and how gross and disgusting and corrupt it is, and yet you also have the deepest sorrow and pity for sinners. And you want to see them come humbly to Christ. We cannot separate our compassion, even though we must admit the corruption. But God here, again, showing his sovereign power over the rise and fall of kings and nations, they exist for his purpose. And so for the most part, From here on out, they are a thorn in Israel's side. And just a few chapters later, Jehoahaz, king of Israel, he's going to receive mercy again from the hand of Syria, but he's not going to repent. Joash, his son, comes to power. Elisha, in one of his last acts as a prophet, gives Joash an opportunity to show some spiritual investment. He presents, Elisha tells Joash, I got an arrow for you and a bow. You're being plagued by the Syrians. I'm telling you right now, shoot some arrows. Shoot some arrows. And he shoots 3. And Elisha says, you should have done like 5 or 6 or 7. Because if you had, God would have wiped Syria out. But because you only did 3, you're going to rout the Syrians 3 times. But they're going to still keep being a problem. How was he supposed to know? How was he supposed to know how to respond to that? It's like telling you to do like a carnival game without giving you the rules. Here's a bow and arrow. Just shoot. The thing is, when a prophet is telling you to do something, he should have been full tilt. Or he should have asked, what's the point of this? The fact that he was kind of lackadaisical about it, he shoots 3 arrows, showed that he didn't have any investment in it. God tells you to do something, then you should go whole hog. Or if you have any real questions, you should ask a question. Instead, he kind of, if a prophet tells you, if I tell a kid out there, here's a bunch of here's a bow and a bunch of arrows. Go ahead, go shoot. What do you think he's going to do? They're going to be invested. They're going to shoot every single one of those, right? They're going to go all in because you didn't give them any restriction. You didn't give any. They're going to go all. They do all of them at the same time. They're going to try and hit this and that. Few of them are just, and that's the idea of what Joash did here. Is he had no real care, concern, or interest at the opportunities that God was giving him, and so 2 Kings 13:22 to 23. Hazael, king of Syria, oppressed. There's a difference, by the way, between Syria and Assyria. The Hazael, king of Syria, oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz. But Yahweh was gracious to them and in compassion on them. And he turned toward them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, nor has he cast them from his presence until now, which gives an indication that at the time that this was being written, 2 Kings, judgment was coming. Hazael, king of Syria, died. Ben-Hadad, his son, again another Ben-Hadad, became king in his place. And it goes on and on. Syria would basically torment Israel until their destruction, as Amos prophesied. So that is Syria and its relationship to Israel. Hopefully you get some lessons out of that. Again, Beit Aven and Beit Eden, which is mentioned in Amos. We're actually not sure of where they are, so I'm not going to make a big deal about it. But it's probably this plain there called Bekah and a city called Beit Adini. But it doesn't necessarily matter. They would have known where that was at the time this was written. All you need to know is that these are real places that God brought judgment on. The return to the land of Kir, that was the place, it was considered or understood to be the place of the origin of the Syrians. That's mentioned in Amos 9:7. And he's essentially predicting that they would return to that place, that they would be forced to return, kind of like to their humble beginnings is the idea. You're not going to be this big old kingdom. You will only fit in your hometown. After being this big old kingdom, you're only going to fit in your little town. And that was fulfilled when Tiglath-Pileser took the people of Damascus captive, transported them to Kir. Who is Tiglath? Tiglath-Pileser is the king of Assyria. So this is prophesying the rise of the Syrian empire, and they're going to be used to judge many of these nations. Now, as I thought about applying this, there's probably a sense in which you have some Syrias in your life. Something God is using to show you his mercy, or maybe to test your patience, or to show you that you need to repent. you probably have some Syrias in your life. And that's kind of the point, is there's a microcosm that we're supposed to bring to these nationwide events of Israel and this whole nation fighting, that we can reduce that down to our own experiences, that, yeah, there's times where I'm being dumb and need to be corrected. There's times where I have sought man's help rather than God's help. There's times when God has shown me extraordinary mercy from unexpected places, even my enemies. There's times when I have been neglectful and I've buddied up with a sin or person that I should not. And we have some Syrias in our life. I was also thinking, there's a sense in which I might be Syria to someone else. That someone's having to deal with me. And I'm bringing that affliction and trial to other people. But again, returning to Amos, Syria is going to be judged ultimately by God. All of us will. All the Syrias in our life and all the ways we've been Syria to other people, in the negative sense, is going to be judged by God. So going back to the question we said at the beginning, how do we avoid that judgment? Well, Amos is going to reveal a future day of not only judgment, but justice, of the day of the Lord and the restoration of Israel. It will be the last words after a lot of judgment that God is going to raise up, he said, the booth of David that has fallen. He's going to call back a remnant, and he's going to put them in a safe place. This is the kingdom of God that is going to come. And as we said this morning, that kingdom of God that is to come belongs to all who have pledged their allegiance to the king. Who is the king? The king is the one who sits on the throne of David, whose voice roars from Zion and his voice from Jerusalem. It is Jesus. And Jesus is not an ordinary king. All other kings expect you to lay down your life for him in order to show your allegiance. The King of heaven, our King of kings, he lays down his life for his people so that they might enter into his kingdom. He proves his love for us. And that is the basis upon which we can join him. We don't have to prove our allegiance to him, so to speak, to enter in. It is by his work. He's the only king that's ever done that. He's the only king who's died and risen again to welcome, to secure his own people and promise them an eternity in heaven, in the new heavens and new earth. And so, how do we avoid judgment? It's not by being a good person. It's not by trying to do better than the Syrians did, or better than the kings of Israel did, or better than Judah did. You cannot be good enough, because even one sin makes us guilty. Instead, what we can do is acknowledge our sinfulness, to come to God not with our excuses and justifications and good works. Oh, but I did this and I did that, and oh, but that situation, it wasn't fair. Just to come up with all of it and say, God, all I bring to you is the sin that condemns me. And somehow beg that you would take these rags and filth and give me a robe and riches and a crown. God says he'll do it. If you have the humility to take him, your sins, confess them, to lay them down and say, I hate this, but it's what I have. I need forgiveness, not because I deserved it. Well, God says that's the prayer I will listen to. A humble and contrite heart he will not deny. When we come by faith in the King, in the one who died for our sins, we can avoid this judgment and enter into an eternal kingdom that will not fall like all these other kingdoms do. If you haven't done that, if you have any questions about that, come talk to me. I'd love to talk to you about Jesus. If you are a believer this afternoon, I hope just in going through a little bit of that history of Syria, you see some lessons about who God is, and maybe shed a little bit of light on the circumstances that are going on in your own heart. So, any questions? This afternoon service, we can chat a little bit more. Any questions? I'm not a Syria expert, by the way, and maybe you're more of an expert than I am, but we know a little bit more than when we started, right, about Syria.